Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. As per usual, we are back with a live episode about to break down, all the games that happened today. And yeah, pretty much all of them stunk except for the last one, which was the Oklahoma City Thunder versus the Pelicans. And, I see we already have a couple of chats from the Homelander, and he's saying skip the other games and go straight into the Thunder game. And I think that's exactly what we're going to do just because it's fresh on our minds. And it was the most entertaining. We don't want to bore you guys all the way until, whenever we end. So we might as well kick it off with a banger.
All right, so let's get into it. So game one, New Orleans Pelicans versus the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? The first, as the commentators mentioned, the first home game for the Oklahoma City Thunder in 5 years, right? I know they were in the playoffs in the bubble, but this is the first one at their actual home arena, right? So pretty wild, right? In terms of, thank the Lord. Yeah. Yeah, you guys are here. Congratulations. So pretty wild in terms of the atmosphere, right? The crowd was great. The energy was nuts. I mean, there were a lot of stretches where the crowd was so loud you couldn't even hear the commentators. I mean, it was just kind of incredible in terms of the energy that the crowd was able to bring, and it kind of powered them at different points through the game, right? Because again, this was a really back and forth game. For a while, it looked like Oklahoma City, had the upper hand, right? New Orleans would fight back every time, with a run of their own. Then, late in the fourth quarter, it looked like New Orleans might, end up stealing the game, right? SGA kind of had a stretch where he was turning the ball over, forced into some really tough shots, right? And again, this is their first playoff game as a group, right? In playoff basketball, which is kind of the theme of today's games, right? Playoff basketball is a lot different than regular season basketball, but the Thunder, handled it pretty well in the end, right? SGA ended up making some big plays coming through for his team, right? With the clutch and one, the big time buckets within the mid range, right? Didn't really, kind of stop settling for some tough shots and, just kind of regain his confidence because it looked like at a certain point he was getting a little bit frustrated by how things were going, right? Which I understand because it looked like they were on a they had a double digit lead and then it kind of went away, but they powered through it. SGA responded well, and I think that was the theme, right? Because we knew playoff basketball was going to be a test for this young team. It's the youngest team in the NBA, so how were they going to respond? Were they going to be able to kind of fight through it, or were they just going to kind of just fall apart? And they responded well, right? Better than pretty much any of the other young teams that we've seen so far, in the playoffs, right? Because a lot of the other ones didn't really do a great job. Obviously, New Orleans is a different matchup. I mean, and again, you can kind of see the differences, which is why, again, this, has the potential to be a very competitive series because New Orleans, even without Zion, still has a lot of good players, still has a lot of length, still has a lot of shooting. It just becomes a lot tougher to close it out. OKC is also a really good defensive team. I mean, the score, speaks for itself, 94-92, right? Both teams are towards the top of the league in defense. Even with OKC being small, you still had Chet Holmgren, who had a really good playoff debut, missed the free throw at the end. But either way, right, like SGA, started off slow, got into a rhythm, and started figuring stuff out. Jalen Williams, right, pretty much from the get-go was ready to go, right? He was probably, the most consistent, like steadiest player over the course of the game, right? SGA turned it up, early and then closed at the end, but Jalen Williams was pretty much a constant. And when SGA was off the floor, right, he was the big catalyst for their runs, right? Lou Dort, right, who had been in playoff games before, right? Only shot 2 for 6, but was 2 for 4, did make some big plays on the defensive end.
Yeah.
Right. Josh Giddey was pretty quiet, right? 2 points, 3 assists, 3 rebounds, 1 for 6, right? But, again, only played 19 minutes. Isaiah Joe was out there and, hit a couple of shots, but really, Kason Wallace, right? Defensively, that was kind of the guy that they put in over Giddey, which was the right decision. Because of his defense, he was the guy that made the key defensive stop on CJ McCollum.
Yeah.
Right. He got scored on him and he got scored on in the previous possession. And then to close out the game, right? He 1-on-1 and kind of caused them to kind of stumble the ball, fumble it around, and then they didn't really get off a clean shot, right? He did create some space and step through, got, an open look, but it's a very difficult shot, especially given the pressure, off balance, one leg or whatever, jumping forward. So that was really the key, is that OKC kind of closed the game out with some really big time defensive plays. Because their offense kind of started falling apart, other than the Shea baskets. Because that's how New Orleans got back in. They were playing great defense and they were kind of, using that defense to get into their offense. But then, eventually, again, SGA ended up, making some of the biggest plays on offense. And, that's why he's their guy, right? That's the guy that you were hoping to see in Kason Wallace, my savior. Yeah, exactly.
Pretty
And that's
much.
probably and that's kind of a thing to see over the course of the playoffs because if Josh Giddey struggles, he's not going to play as much because you do have Kason Wallace. They're very different players, but because of what he can do defensively while also being a better shooter, it's probably a better fit, especially to close games, and that's what you're going to see. And you look at Shea's stat line, right? Even though it felt like a nasty game at times, he did have 3 turnovers, 11 for 24, right? So that's almost 50%. Was 0 of 3 from 3, but 6 of 7 from the line. Still had 28 points, 6 rebounds. So, again, -1. So obviously, again, he can be better. And I think that's kind of the main thing is that the first game jitters are out of the way.
Yeah.
And this was a game that you couldn't really afford to lose. And this was a game that New Orleans was desperately trying to win and probably needed to win. Not that they can't, win another game. But obviously, if you're the road team, you want to come out and make a big statement in game one. But OKC, again, they responded well. And that kind of bodes well because, again, there's going to be other teams that are going to be better than New Orleans. So if they want to make a deep run, this is a good time to kind of learn the growing pains of closing out games.
Yeah, get it done in the first round. Don't let it come back to bite you later on when you do potentially advance. And I'm looking at New Orleans as well. I think this was a statement game from them as well because it was competitive even without Zion. And you look at Brandon Ingram, you're like, okay, that was really, really bad. A lot of forced shots, but you do have to give Lou Dort a lot of credit because he was bothering him like every possession. Herb Jones, he wasn't very efficient, but did a lot on defense, had a lot of mental mistakes as well. Valanciunas, I think, was a huge deal. He put up 20 rebounds, which is crazy. Double-double as well. So I think he didn't really get played off the floor like, we thought that he was going to potentially be, in the series. Obviously, it's one game. It's not, first to one. It's first to four. So it's going to be a long series, I think. So there's still room for that to happen. But then you look at McCollum. He also got bothered as well. I think Trey Murphy, questionable shots at times, but still kept them in the game on both ends of the floor. So like I said, I think this was a statement game from both teams where it's like Oklahoma City is basically telling you they're better, but Pelicans, they're not going down without a fight, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I really thought that this game was, like I said, a statement game from both teams. Just, like you said, jitters. I think, both teams are very young. They're both very different in the way that they approach the game as well. Because, the Pelicans very defensive oriented, especially without Zion. And you could clearly see that because they limited Shea a lot down the stretch, which is kind of something to, I think, monitor because I think they have the potential to do that again. But I think OKC kind of has weapons where, you look at J-Dub and he's like pretty much unstoppable as well, just like Shea. And then Chet Holmgren as well, I think, is a huge factor.
Right. And that's going to be the key for Oklahoma City is that the guys outside of Shea are going to have to step up because they're going to guard him differently, I think, than, what happened in the regular season. And we saw it, right? Like New Orleans was trying for most of the game to put more length on him, more size, right? They wanted Herb Jones and Trey Murphy, to kind of take cracks at him, right? It was where it was like CJ McCollum or other guys, of similar size or smaller, right? Where he was doing more of his damage, right? The big and one that he got, right? To kind of put them up, right? That was over CJ McCollum, right? McCollum is what, 6'3", 6'4", right? Shea's 6'6" with long arms. So, obviously that's the difference. But when you have the other guys show up, like Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren, that can make all the difference, right? Because again, if those three guys play really well, right, that's where they're probably going to win the series. Especially if Brandon Ingram has those type of games. Because again, without Zion, he's going to be the guy that kind of needs to step up. And, they did a pretty good job of limiting him. He made some, most of his shots that he made were, other than like a couple, were really difficult, like at the end of the clock shots, which are the shots that if you're OKC, you live with, right? Because, again, he can make some of those shots, but, he only made 5 for 17, in a game that they lost by 2. So, they were really keying in on taking him away defensively and trying to make McCollum more of a focal point, for New Orleans. And if you do that, right, that's probably a win for Oklahoma City because you'd rather CJ McCollum try to kind of like take guys one-on-one than Brandon Ingram because Brandon Ingram has more length and has more, tools, to in his bag, so to speak, to kind of get away with being able to score because he's much taller. He's got way more length. So, but, again, shout out to New Orleans because they did play very well. Murphy worries me a lot. Yeah,
He's
that's kind
basically
of
a
the thing.
six starter, and he's
Yeah,
great on
again,
both ends of the floor. It's scary.
yeah, and that's the thing is that this guy is a six man when Zion starts, right?
Hmm.
Versus like without Zion, he's the other guy, and again, it's a different look, right? Because he's not as physical as Zion. He's not taking the ball and bullying through guys, but he's also a very good athlete, and he's obviously a much better 3-point shooter, and he can shoot way outside, right? Like I mean, some of those shots he was taking were from like 28, 30 feet. And
Yeah.
again, he shot 5 for 12, which is over 40%. So that's so that means he's a really good shooter on high volume. So you have to get out on him. And if he, starts to kind of get hot, that's where it can be a real problem.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting because with Oklahoma City, right, in the regular season, they were a great 3-point shooting team. But in the playoffs, 3-point shooting tends to be worse because the defenses are a lot more keyed in. And, the guys that are kind of just spot up shooters tend to be limited a lot more. And that's the thing with a guy like SGA who doesn't have to rely on the three in order to score. And that's, going to be something that can help him out. But the other guys like Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams, those guys are good 3-point shooters. I know they didn't shoot great from three. Um, but the fact that they can do multiple things, on both ends of the floor, that's kind of where OKC, is a little bit different from a lot of other young teams, as we'll get into. But again, New Orleans, keep in mind, they've been in the playoffs before. Even though it is a young team, they made the playoffs in 2022, I think, without Zion, right? They took the Suns, who won like 60 whatever games, 6 games. And a lot of the guys that are on the team right now are a lot of the same guys, right? Like McCollum was there. Ingram was there. I don't think Murphy was there.
Mm-mm.
But like, again, the core guys like McCollum and Ingram, Alvarado, a lot of those guys were there. I think Nance was there as well. So that's kind of the key for New Orleans is if a guy like Murphy gets going, that's where you might be in trouble because again, he's a high volume shooter who can pretty much hit threes from anywhere, and he's
Yeah.
a really good athlete. So if you and that can kind of make up for like, okay, you don't have Zion, but you do have another guy who could potentially give you 20 a game. But at the end of the game, you kind of saw that's where you miss Zion because if you had Zion, as an extra guy, he could be the guy that could have played downhill, bullied his way to the basket, and maybe he gets an and one, maybe he ties it up. So that way you don't have to necessarily settle for a tough contested three by CJ McCollum. So that's where they're gonna miss him probably at the end of games, but they're still gonna be able to compete. Again, we'll see how the next game goes. But again, like with OKC, I think the biggest thing is you're glad that you got out of that game alive. Because if they had lost that game, that would have been, a rough start to the playoffs. It wouldn't mean the end, but obviously, like if you're OKC, you kind of need to defend home court against this team, especially because New Orleans is actually much better on the road than they are at home. So as
Yeah.
long as you don't lose any of the home games, you'll be okay, right? If you lose one or two of those, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, and I do want to give the Thunder credit because I think this is something that's kind of undervalued. Is like not knowing your opponent very early. They didn't know until Friday, so they only had like really what
Yep.
a couple of days, maybe one day to really install like a real game plan for this team. So that's something that I do want to give them credit to as well. And obviously J Dub, I think he was their X factor and he showed up. He was like their spark, because once he got going, it kind of wakes everybody else up. It wakes up the entire arena, wakes up the rest of the team, and then that's kind of where you see everybody feed off of that. So, yeah, kudos to them for actually getting the dub.
And that's the thing because these type of games are important. We needed to see what they were going to look like in a playoff environment, in a crunch time game where there were no guarantees that they were going to win because they were down, right? Late in the game with about 3 minutes to go, and you didn't really know how the game was going to go. But the fact that you got that is, kind of a huge load off your back, and now you kind of carry that, enthusiasm into the next game, right? So now you go into the game with momentum because now New Orleans is down 1-0 or 0-1 or whatever, and they have to win the next game, or else it's probably going to be really difficult for them to win the series because they're going to have to win at least one in Oklahoma City, and
Yeah,
if you win the first one, that's helpful. Homelander says still going to be a sweep.
he
Who
loves
knows?
that
I mean,
word. He loves it.
yeah. I mean, again, like that's the thing is that in a close game, I don't necessarily know if New Orleans is going to be able to, kind of pull off the offense in crunch time because you kind of saw what was going on, right? Because once Valanciunas comes out, that's your inside guy. That's the guy that's going to get you offensive rebounds and get, extra possessions. And that wasn't really happening, once he came out. I know they got the offensive boards off the long rebounds or whatever, but they weren't really clean, right? Like he can kind of just get the rebound and just put it back up, get fouled or whatever. But they were kind of just all over the place at the end of the game. Um, so I expect like game two to be a little bit cleaner of a game
Hmm.
now that it's like, okay, now we're more used to playing against each other. We'll see how the adjustments go. Um, Again, the coaching was fine, right? I think both teams did a relatively good job. I mean, the last play of the game for Willie Green or whatever wasn't great, but I think that had more to do with Kason Wallace breaking up the play with his defense. The challenge I think Dagnall took, I don't think that was a great idea, but it didn't hurt them.
Agreed.
But I don't think that was a smart challenge because they lost the timeout. And you probably could have won the jump ball. I mean, because Chet is so tall with long arms and he's a good athlete that like I don't think you'd be worried about losing it. But that's kind of a little nitpick.
Yeah.
But either way, a good game, a solid game one from Oklahoma City where it's like it looked like they might lose the game, but they did pull it out. And I think that's probably going to be the difference, between, like them winning and losing the series. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like Xander Cade, welcome to the chat.
What's
Talk
up, man?
Clippers. You know what? I think we'll get into that
Yeah,
game
we could do
next.
them. Yeah, we could do them next.
Right. Clippers Mavs game one, 109-97. I think this was, obviously there were multiple games that I think were upsets. I think, well, I guess it's kind of the two middle ones. This was definitely one. It was 109-97, but the final score really was not an indicator of how the game went. It was pretty much like from the first quarter, right? The first 5 minutes, pretty much just an absolute smashing. And it's kind of funny because for me going into the series, like before I knew about Kawhi, I was gonna pick the Clippers to win the series because I just felt like they're more talented. I think I would probably trust them more in a 7-game series over the Mavs. The thing that concerned me was when they were talking about Kawhi and we didn't know whether or not he was going to play. That made me a lot more nervous about it. But the fact that obviously they, kind of smashed the Mavs. This is kind of the way if you're the Clippers to pretty much win the series is you're kind of able to limit Luka and Kyrie. I know they ended up having, however many points they had. I know both of them had what I think 64 combined, but a lot of that was kind of when the game was over, right? During the, the early part of the game, they didn't really do a lot, and neither did their teammates, right? And that's kind of the difference here is that when you look at the Clippers, they just have more good players, right? Which is why going into the series, before I knew about the Kawhi thing, I thought they were going to probably win, right? I mean, Harden had a great game, right? Obviously, 28 and 8 assists, 2 blocks, 2 rebounds, and that's kind of the key, right? When he plays well, right? That's what makes the Clippers a lot better, right? And obviously, like when you have him and Paul George playing, at a good level, and Zubac obviously just kind of eating the Dallas bigs alive. And I think that was the other key is that Dallas's front court was really bad in this game, especially the two bigs. And that's kind of the difference, right? Because if Zubac is going to put up 20 and 15 and basically play, like like a all-star level big, yeah, like that's the difference. Is that you can kind of replace and make up for some of Kawhi's stuff. When you have everyone else playing really well. Terrence Mann, right? 9 rebounds, 13 points. Westbrook off the bench with 13, 4 and 2, playing really good defense, I think, whenever he was out there, which is another key. Because again, he's a good athlete, he's strong. Um, so I think, that's something where like if you can tap into that, that can kind of mess some things up. Amir Coffey, right, 2 for 7, but again, did his job on the boards, right? Wasn't gonna play a ton, right? Played 25 minutes. So that's the key is that with the Clippers, I do think they have more talent. So I think that's probably where, with a healthy Kawhi, you probably win the series, right? You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
obviously, and that's kind of the funny thing, like with a lot of these games where a lot of key stars were out, but the other guys stepped up. And I think for the Clippers, you're at home, so you don't really want to lose either of the home games at all. So you did what you're supposed to do. Um, 18 of 36 from three is also, really important because for the Clippers, that's kind of their offensive identity where it's a lot of jump shots. And when you get hot, you can pretty much blow teams out. And I think with the Mavs, again, it's kind of a lack of talent in some of these areas, right? Because again, like, Derek Jones Jr., Maxi Kleba, right? Dante Exum, you know, Like it's just not a lot of like great options there in the front court, especially if they're playing as bad as they played, right? Like Gafford had 2 quick fouls, didn't really do anything. Lively came in, didn't really do anything. If the Mavs bigs are going to be that bad, they're not going to be able to win the series, I don't think, because they need those guys to be on the floor and be effective. And Xander Cade says Clippers in 6. Um, and
There's a
that's the thing,
pathway.
right? Yeah, especially if Kawhi comes back and he's, pretty close to 100%, that's going to make it a lot more likely for them to win. I think a lot of people were pretty shocked by the result. So I think you give the Clippers a lot of credit, again, because they've been playing without Kawhi for a little while. They did, even though a lot of people talked about how bad they were post All-Star break, they did close the regular season pretty well. Um, and, again, they've kind of been here before without Kawhi. And this is kind of why you get a guy like Hart, because without Kawhi, he kind of replaces your production. We're going to have to see if he can sustain it, because last year, right, we remember what happened with Philly, where he had the, really good early games. And then as the series went on, against Boston, he ran out of gas. But again, he's really the main X factor, I think, for the Clippers. When he plays well, that's when the Clippers can kind of regain the magic that we saw earlier in the year when they were pretty much blowing the waters off of everybody.
Yeah, and this game was wild. To really kind of think about it, Clippers, they set the tone, and really, it's kind of interesting if you look at what they did with Zubac early. That I think really put the Mavericks in a hole, because they went at Gafford right away, and I got like flashbacks to when Gafford was on the Wizards, and I was like, Gafford does struggle with a lot of bigger guys, because he is an undersized big. And especially when they get physical with him, he's always had foul trouble. So that I think is a really, really big key. So you can definitely tell the game plan for that. And then obviously Harden, showing up is a huge deal. I think they don't really win this game if he doesn't show up. If he has a horrible game, maybe they win by like 3, but not like how they won here tonight. And that's the craziest part. And I think he had like one of the better quotes of this series, like so far. And it's like, he said, obviously Kawhi's out, so my playmaking, my volume is going to go up a little bit more. And he took advantage of it. And that's exactly what he did. He did everything that you could possibly want, but not just, did it, but he did it at an efficient level. And I think that's the key as well.
And for him, that jump shot is really key for him, because now he's no longer quite the same Harden, where he can kind of just get to the basket at will and get to the free throw line, whenever he wants. Now a lot of the fouls are drawn from the perimeter, right? He was 6 of 11 from 3. A lot of his, like kind of classic go-to step back threes, right? When he's hitting those, right, that's when he looks, like a really, really good version of Harden, right? When he's playing the point, distributing, and doing all that. Xander Cade says, "You guys got this." And again, this is huge, right? To get a blowout
Homelander
win
said
against,
that too, Xander Cade.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And it's like this is huge to get, a win like that without Kawhi, because he is their best player. You need him if you want to make a deep run, but obviously, again, you don't make the deep run without winning, the early games, right? So now the Mavs have to find a way to adjust, get their bigs going, and they're going to have to win probably game 2, because obviously it's not that you're going to lose the series, but we remember statistically, right? More often than not, if you lose the first 2 games, you're probably going to lose the series.
Yeah.
And obviously, the Mavs being the lower seed, they're going to have to win at least one game in LA. So, and obviously, it becomes a little harder, as the pressure starts to mount. And we don't know how the other Dallas guys are going to respond, right? Because that's the thing, Luka and Kyrie, if the other guys don't really show up, they're probably not going to win unless they both have like 50 points each or something crazy like that. And again, a lot of those points to me were kind of when the game was already out of reach, because it pretty much stayed like somewhere around a 20, you know, point lead pretty much like throughout, like from the first quarter onwards. I think it got up to 30 or whatever. And I know the Mavs kind of cut it a little bit, but like I said, the final score was not an indication of how that game went. They destroyed the Mavs.
Yeah. And that
Which
was a
again,
trend all day.
yeah, exactly. That was most of the games today. So big win by the Clippers. And like you said, an absolute tone setter, because if they had lost that game, that would have been rough, right? Obviously, it's not the end of the series, but you're at home, um, and that would have made it a lot more difficult. Game 2
Yeah.
is more important than game 1 for both teams. I mean, the thing is that it tends to be more important for the team, obviously, that's down, right? Because if you lose, you go down 0-2. So that's sometimes what happens. Game time for App was more than enough. Yeah, we'll get into that one. But that's kind of the important thing, because it's like a lot of times we'll see in game two, the team that won the first game tends to kind of take its foot off the gas because they know we won the game. So worst case scenario, we split, whereas the team that's down, right, the worst case scenario for them is they're down 0-2. They do go back home, but for the Mavs, again, it's important that they win one of these first two games. Not that they can't win the series, it just becomes a lot harder, and that's not going to happen if a lot of their role players kind of lay an egg. And again, their stars. I think Luka probably needed to be better, right? He shot 11 for 26, 4 of 12 from three, right? He did have 13 rebounds, but only 6 assists, right? And I
with
think
4
there were like
turnovers.
yeah, 4 turnovers, and there were kind of like certain stretches where again it was kind of hero ballish, right? Which again I know was kind of his thing. But there were some possessions where the Clippers did play great defense and kind of limited him into tough shots. And if everybody remembers, the thing with the Mavs when they would play against the Clippers was the Zubac factor, right? Because like Zubac would be switched on to Luka, and he'd be able to create space and get those step back threes. But again, Zubac was very playable in this game, right? Like obviously he was able to get a ton of boards, finish around the rim, punish the bigs, and that's a big key, right? Because you need Zubac, I think, against a lot of teams, because most teams have at least one big that you kind of have to at least somewhat think about. Not every team has like a star big man, but most teams do have a center. Um, and if you can get those type of games out of Zubac, he's going to obviously be able to play a lot more.
Yeah.
And this is where it becomes a chess match because what does Jason Kidd do? So that way Gafford and Lively don't lay an egg as badly as they do, right? Like how does Gafford avoid the early fouls? How can he be more of an impact on the boards, right? I mean, I think he had 0 rebounds, right? And
Yep.
he was 1 for 4. 1 for 4 when he's been shooting like 70-80% from the field
Yeah.
with the Mavs, right? Washington was okay. He had 11.7 rebounds, so he's probably the best of their front court players. But again, it's not saying much because I mean, again, Derek Jones Jr. 0 for 4, 0 points, 1 rebound, 2 blocks. Daniel Gafford 3 points, 0 rebound, 0 steals, 1 block. Derek Lively 3 points, 3 blocks, 4 rebounds, 1 for 3, and a lot of the plus minuses were really off. Right,
Yeah.
they were kind of forced to roll with Maxi Kleba, which for the Mavs, again, he hasn't been as good this year. The whole point of getting Daniel Gafford was kind of to move Lively to the second unit, so you don't have to play guys like Maxi Kleba and Dwight Powell as much. But in a scenario like that where he's forced to play more, you're going to be smaller. You're probably going to struggle a lot more in terms of rebounding. I guess you'll have more floor spacing because he's more of a pick and pop guy as opposed to a roller. But I don't know. Like that's kind of the thing where it's
Yeah.
like the Mavs were starting to be favored by a lot of people. I think because of the Kawhi injury. But obviously now the Clippers have kind of flipped that momentum. So now if the Mavs if they don't win game two, it's gonna be a lot. It's gonna be very difficult to win the series. So great game by the Clippers. We'll see how the Mavs adjust. Because I'm sure they'll probably do something.
Oh
Josh
yeah.
Green maybe plays more, right? Because I think if the other wings don't play very well, that like if Derek Jones Jr. is like this bad, that might be something that you might have to switch up where you might have to start another wing out there. Because it's it's kind of hard to play him if he's not going to do much. Maybe you start Exum. I don't know, but again, the options aren't great because you got to think about it in terms of the. I know Dallas defensively has been a lot better, but again, who's guarding Paul George, right? Who's guarding Kawhi when he comes back, assuming he comes back? Even like Harden, who's guarding him, right? I guess Derek Jones Jr., but he's kind of small, even though he's got long arms, very athletic. He's very skinny, and it's kind of hard to put like a super skinny guy on Harden because he is kind of a strong dude. That can kind of bully some people, even on the perimeter when he's
Yeah.
trying to create some space. And then obviously Paul George, because of his length, he can shoot over guys. Kawhi, when he comes back, can do the same thing. So it's going to be tough, I think, for the Mavs. And I think, again, we got to remember the Clippers were really good earlier in the season. And if they get that mojo back from earlier in the season, they're the better team. Which, again, before Kawhi's injury, I picked them to win the series. And I kind of flip-flopped once I didn't know whether or not he was going to play. But,
Yeah.
now I feel a little bit more confident about my initial pick. But it is one game, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Clippers have to win game two. I think that's like the key. Because Kawhi's health is kind of uncertain, so Harden's gonna have to step up as well. You're gonna need another Harden masterclass game, pretty much. And you also need the other guys, even like Westbrook. I think you need him to show up again, like how he did tonight. And Terrence Mann. I think, everybody really showed up. And I think this is kind of like the ideal kind of game that you would want to have if Kawhi wasn't present, especially in the playoffs. They did a good job, I think, limiting everybody else on the Mavericks except for Kyrie and Luka. Like you said, Luka could have had a better game. Kyrie probably could have had a better game as well. But, you look around, nobody else really did anything for Dallas. And that was kind of the way the game was going. And it was a complete blowout. Like, if you watch this game, you know how bad this game really was.
If you watch, this was not a 12-point game. This was not a 12.
Not even close.
Yeah. And that's the thing with the Clippers. When your best player is out, everybody else has got to step up, and that's what they did.
Yeah.
Moving on into the next game. Don't really want to talk about this one, honestly, but it was Miami-Boston.
Yeah.
It was bad, 114-94. I know it was like a 20-point game. I know Miami cut it down or whatever, but it was awful. And again, this is probably going to be, other than the Magic Cavs series, this is probably going to be the worst series. And I think this one, mainly because of the fact that it's so lopsided in terms of talent. When you're without Jimmy Butler, when you're without Terry Rozier, and it's pretty much Tyler Hero playing point guard when he's not a point guard, it's tough, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you look at Miami's guys, they're starting five, then you look over at Boston's, and it's just not really fair, right? And that's kind of like the big difference, right? Tyler Hero, Caleb Martin, Nikola Jovic, Jaime Jaquez Jr., and Bam Adebayo, not great. Right, that's really the issue there. I mean, Boston, they destroyed them. I mean, Porzingis was good. I mean, most of the starters played really well. Even Tatum, who didn't shoot well, had a good game. Right, he rebounded. He had 10 assists. Still had 23 points. Right, so everybody pretty much played well. Horford, Hauser, they had a good game. Right, Pritchard was solid. Holiday was fine. Pretty much everybody for the Celtics played well. And when they all play well, and obviously when they hit the 22 threes, Celtics bombs away. Yeah, that's really the difference.
Yeah.
Because we know this is a three-point oriented team. With Porzingis, you do have a little bit more versatility on offense. And even guys like Tatum and Brown obviously have some tricks and tools that they can do. But, again, this is kind of why, with the Celtics, you don't necessarily want to underestimate them. Obviously, in this series, right, it's a very lopsided matchup. Homelander, Boston, so tough. Yes, they're a very good team. They won 64 games for a reason. They are in the East, but they are really good.
They're elite, bro.
They have a lot of talent at every position, especially in that starting five. And they still have some guys off the bench that are solid rotational pieces. It just really comes down to, again, what does it look like, assuming they come out of the East, facing off whoever comes out of the West? Because I think, again, when you look at the Eastern Conference, it is the weaker conference. And with all the injuries in the Eastern Conference, it kind of really does open up the path for Boston, right? They got the easier bracket. And a lot of the other key stars for a lot of the other teams are hurt, right? No Butler, no Giannis for Milwaukee, right? Embiid is not quite 100% for Philly. So they're probably going to kind of fly under the radar, I think, in the earlier round, because this is going to be a really quick series. I think this is probably going to be, if you had to pick which one is the most likely to be a sweep, it's this one.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
no question.
there's not really a whole lot. Yeah, there's not really a whole lot to analyze here. Just it's one team that's way better than the other. And the approach early on was good, right, where they set the tone, right, and they scored the first 12, 14 unanswered points, kind of to let Miami know this isn't the same as last year. It did kind of get away, right, in the fourth quarter, which is kind of what happens. You take your foot off the gas, right? It was on an almost 40-point game, cut down to 12 or 13 or whatever, right? Because DeLon Wright hit 4 or 5 threes or whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe Miami makes an adjustment where maybe they start him or at the very least play him more. I just don't think there's a whole lot Miami can do because you're so undermanned against, the best team in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, and that's exactly how the playoffs kind of used to be, when it was 1 versus 8, maybe 10 years ago where it was very lopsided. But, now it's a little bit more competitive. But like you said, Jimmy Butler's not playing. But I think the Celtics bench, they deserve a huge shout out. I think, them showing up is definitely a reason why it was so lopsided. Sam Hauser making his threes, Horford having an impact, I think, on both ends of the floor, and then Peyton Pritchard being fairly efficient as well. I think those three guys combined takes pressure off your starters, especially when Tatum's having a wishy-washy game offensively, but then, he's doing everything else, getting everybody involved. It's really tough. And you can, like you said, you see the difference. Porzingis, he's their huge X factor. He's showing up. He's consistent. He looks happy. It's great. Holiday, he showed up on defense, not really on offense, I guess. But, Derek White, he alleviates some of that pressure as well. Jaylen Brown, everybody showed up, like you said. And yeah, there's not too much to analyze because, from Miami's point of view, I mean, you couldn't really get the job done. I mean, your starters, like, your main guys and Hawkes and Bam, they did the best they could. But when everybody else is kind of just not on that level yet, you get this kind of result.
I think that team is going to look pretty different next year. I mean, I don't know, what exactly is going to happen, but just all the rumors that have been going around, right, talking about them star hunting and whatnot. I feel like it's probably going to be time for them to probably do something because I don't quite necessarily think that they're good enough at this point to probably continue to be one of the upper tier teams. Obviously, again, injuries are rough, so we'll see. But yeah, this is going to be a quick series, right?
Yeah.
Miami's going to go home. They're going to have a long off season, and that's tough for your season to end that way, right? Where it's like there was so much hype and excitement about them possibly picking up Damian Lillard. Not only did they not get him, he went to another team in the Eastern Conference, and then Boston got better, obviously, and now you're playing them in the first round. You're undermanned, and now you're going to go home the way that they sent, the way that the Heat sent the Celtics home last year, and that's rough. That's a really tough season for Miami, right? Where a lot of injuries, and that was kind of really, the unfortunate part of it, right? Again, like even the guy that they picked up, Terry Rozier, he's not able to play because he has a neck injury, which is rough, right? Butler didn't have a great season anyways, and obviously now he's hurt. He's going to be out long, for a while. Homelander says Miami washed.
It's different, bro.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's starting to feel like the core group is probably going to have to change. Right, you know what I mean, and
that's what we even talked about on the Miami Heat Zone podcast. Like, we talked about it. Like, what is Bam's ceiling on this kind of team? What does Jimmy Butler's future with the team look like? Like you said, they do have to do a lot of retooling because you can't kind of just appear in the playoffs every year and then the same story.
Yeah, and again, we'll get to this, because we do live streams after teams get eliminated, so that's probably when we'll get into more of like what the teams that get eliminated will have to do in the offseason. So we'll get into more of that when it happens. But yeah, it's a tough position to be in. They're not the only team in this position, but it is brutal.
Yeah.
And then for the last game, right, Pacers Bucks. This one I think caught a lot of people by surprise as well. Right, Milwaukee just blew the doors off of Indiana, 109-94. Again, the final score was not quite indicative of how it went. I mean, the game was basically over after the first half, right? I mean, Damian Lillard just went nuts in the first half, had 35 in the first half, 0 in the second half, which by that point they were up by, enough where it was like, as long as other guys kind of get involved, you weren't going to lose this game.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the thing. This was another statement game, right, from the Bucks, because everybody was starting to kind of count them out after the Giannis injury. Before the Giannis injury, I actually picked the Bucks to win this series because I thought that they were the better team, even with the fact that it's a tough matchup. I know that they lost to them 4 times or whatever in the regular season. But again, when Lillard's playing like that, that's kind of what can elevate, Milwaukee, with or without Giannis. You need him obviously to close the deal in terms of making a deep run. But, for a game or two, this is kind of what you need. The Homelander, Dame is insane. Yeah, this was a vintage Lillard performance in the first half, right? I mean, and that's pretty much all that you needed, right? Because other guys chipped in, right? Middleton at 23, Portis had 15 and 11, Lopez had 11 points, 4 rebounds, 3 blocks. Beasley had some shots, Connaughton made some plays, Crowder had a couple shots, right? So it was really an all-around team effort on both ends of the floor. And I think you kind of saw the difference between a team that has made a lot of deep playoff runs versus a team like Indiana, where this is their first time in a playoff environment. And they didn't really respond all that well, right? Unlike Oklahoma City, they didn't really show up. To be fair, they did have a lot of good looks that just kind of clanked. They shot 8 for 38 from 3, barely over 20%, which is awful. But that's kind of one of the issues, right, with a team that relies very heavily on the 3-point shot, is that those type of looks don't go in as consistently in the playoffs. And when you don't have other things that you can do, that's where it becomes really difficult. And then obviously Halliburton wasn't really great in this game, right? He had 9 points, 8 assists, 7 boards, only took like 5 shots. He went 4, of 7, I think. Yeah. So, okay, 37 shots,
Mm-hmm.
but just wasn't good enough, right? It kind of felt like he was playing kind of like just like he was a little bit,
Scared. He was
nervous. Like,
rattled, bro. It was
yeah,
first time jitters.
right. Yeah. And we know, the history between these two teams, right, over the course of the regular season, where they both have had a lot to say about one another. But Indiana didn't really look prepared, right? Even with Rick Carlisle, right? He went with 11 guys, I think, in the first quarter or first half or whatever, which, is way too many players. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that pretty much nobody's going to get a rhythm.
Yep.
Nobody knows what their role is. And that also means you don't really know who to really put out there, right? Siakam was really the only guy who looked comfortable, which in a way kind of makes sense considering he's been on playoff teams, including a championship team.
Yeah.
He had 36 and 13, but he can't do it alone, right? He needs help from the other guys, specifically Halliburton, right? TJ McConnell pretty much outplayed Halliburton in this game. And he, I mean, he was okay, in spurts, but, if Halliburton's going to be that, there's no way you're going to be able to, win this series because you need Halliburton, to kind of be the best point guard on the floor, right? And that's kind of the funny thing with Lillard is that the previous Indiana games, he wasn't that effective. He wasn't that efficient. So you were kind of wondering, is it the Indiana defense that's limiting him? Is he just missing some tough shots? Because it looked like in some of those games they were trapping him and playing really good defense. But
Yeah.
in this game, he hit all those tough shots because it wasn't like Indiana was just leaving him open.
Yeah.
Like some of them were just kind of classic vintage, really tough Dame shots, right? Like
Pulling up from
plays.
deep.
Yeah, 4-point plays, step back, deep threes, like you said. I mean, like that's what he does, right? When he's
Yep.
making those shots, he's really tough to stop. Is he going to do it 4 out of 7 times? Probably not, but he did do it once, right? So then that's kind of the first key is that it's the first of 4, and this was a game that I don't think people expected the Bucks to win. I think they were like 1.5-point underdogs, which isn't that significant, right? So it's not like people thought they were guaranteed to lose, but a lot of people were leaning towards Indiana to win the game and the series. I think there were some people who felt like even before the injury, right, that the Pacers were probably going to win. But obviously, without Giannis, you thought it would be even more difficult. But those guys showed up. They were prepared. They were ready for what Indiana was going to do, and Indiana was not.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens in the next game. We'll see if they clank as many open threes because they did get a lot. They did create a lot of good looks, but they didn't fall. So if they fall in the next game, that can obviously kind of swing it because that's what Indiana has to do. They're not going to be able to win a game shooting that poorly from 3. Nobody really is, especially because it's high volume. When you take 43s and you shoot 20%, I mean that's a good chunk of your shots, right? That's probably close to half the shots they took, right? They took 91 shots, 38 of them were threes. So that's almost so that's a very high volume. So you're just not going to win games like that. So they're going to have to obviously do a better job on both ends of the floor, right? Like they're going to need to make those shots. And they're going to have to do a better job of guarding Lillard. They did do it in the second half because he had 0 points, but that wasn't attempted in the first half because the way they were guarding him in the second half was very different. They were trapping and blitzing him. But like we talked about, with the previous games from last night, when you do that, then that kind of means that you're sort of conceding shots for other guys, right? That means you're going to just be like, we're going to be okay with Bobby Portis trying to beat us one-on-one.
Right.
Or, Malik Beasley hitting shots, because he's getting good looks. Or AJ Green or whatever, right? He clanked like 3 straight open shots in the corner. And those are the type of shots, I guess, if you're going to trap and blitz Lillard, those are the shots you're going to give up. But if everybody's kind of on fire, that's where it's really tough, right? They shot 14, Milwaukee was 14 of 37 from 3. And that's a big part of their offense, especially without Giannis, right? Because without Giannis, you don't have the guy that can kind of just attack the rim and just kind of go downhill, right? Because it's not a very athletic team without him.
Yeah.
So without him, that means you're going to have to win the 3-point battle, and they did by a very significant margin.
Yeah.
And that's key. Defend at home, right? If you play good at home, you're going to win the series, right?
Yep.
Because Indiana is going to have to steal at least one game in Milwaukee in order to win because they're the road team.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, like, this is why the Bucks brought Dame here. Last year we saw them get bounced because they didn't have anybody else, outside of Giannis, especially when he, missed the games. It was tough. But looking at the roster now, And you see the Lillard impact for sure. And you know his 35 points in the first half were the second highest total by any player in the first half of playoff basketball in the past 25 years. So that means, you know, Durant would be the one who's ahead of him with 38 points in 2019. So history. Big deal though. And you look around at, you know, Tyrese Halliburton, I think, you know, it's the same thing with Orlando and what they're going through. It's just playoff jitters, young team, young star. Same thing with Paolo. You know, they're going to get their footing, maybe probably too late in the series. But regardless, you know, you gotta be able to stop something. And sometimes, you know, you can't. But we are, I think I can speak for myself, very quick to forget, you know, how impactful Damian Lillard can be in the playoffs. We just haven't seen it in a long time and a whole lot of it. That's the issue. But, you know, we saw what he did, you know, against OKC and teams like that. But regardless, it's crazy to think, you know, deer in the headlights was what yeah, exactly. They looked lost. They looked young. They didn't really look like they had a game plan on both ends of the floor, you know. And like you said, Siakam looked like the only mature NBA player out there, and that's a problem. You can't have that as a playoff team.
Right. Yeah. I mean, no pun intended, but yeah, it was a deer in the headlights type of thing. I mean, that's the rough part because they looked like a young team. But this is where again you go into game 2, you make adjustments. I would hope you don't try putting out 11 players in the first half again. And that's the thing because there were so many guys that just did not look like they belonged out there. I mean, and some of it again was because they missed, you know, some decent looks. But I mean, like Ben Shepherd, right, who's a rookie, right? He was 1 for 5, 1 of 4 from 3, mostly quality looks, but you know, it just wasn't that great, right?
Even stepped out of bounds on a catch and shoot
Yeah,
opportunity.
yeah. Jalen Smith, right? Kind of a wild game from him. You know, he did have 7 boards. But I don't know. That's kind of the thing is that like you just look around at the roster, and that second unit for the Pacers had been, you know, one of the deadliest second units out there, right? That's one of the reasons why they're one of the best offensive teams in the NBA
TJ
because pretty
McConnell.
much, yeah, exactly. TJ McConnell and pretty much everybody, you know, in their rotation was typically like a double-digit scoring threat, in one way or another. But it just wasn't working. And that's kind of the big thing is that, you know, again, the threes are going to have to fall at some point because they're probably not going to be able to win, you know, a grit and grind dogfight type game where nobody can hit a shot and they need to find something late. It's probably going to be the Bucks because they're the more mature team that's been there before. Um, but again, Halliburton, that's the guy that needs to step up because in a game like this, that's kind of what you look at, right? Because if he's playing well, then that makes a lot of the other stuff a lot easier because then it becomes a lot more comfortable, right, for the other players out there who, you know, don't really play a whole lot. Um, but, you know, they're ready, you know, because their best player makes it easier for them, right? Look at guys like, say, like a Jokic, you know, or, you know, other stars right around the league, and you kind of see the difference. And obviously that's an unfair comparison with Halliburton because again, this is his first time in a playoff situation, right? It's one game, so we'll see if he bounces back. But he's going to have to be more aggressive, right? Because again, the reason why he's so good is not just because he can pass, but also because of the fact that he is a good, really good offensive player
Yeah.
when he's got it going, right? But when he's not really looking for his offense and kind of just dribbling around in a no man's land, he looks like a different player and he becomes a lot easier to guard, a lot easier to read, right? He
Yeah.
had like 3 turnovers, which is not like a ton, right? But he is a pretty low turnover guy, right? He's generally getting like, you know, double digit assists and not more than like 1 or 2 turnovers usually in a game.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, like he just didn't really look comfortable. Maybe that's the other factor where we know he got hurt earlier in the year and maybe he still hasn't recovered. So maybe he just doesn't, you know, feel like himself. I don't know. But I feel like it's probably a combination of probably that, but also first game playoff jitters. And that's where, you know, if he can figure that part out, and he's a smart player, obviously. So, you know, it's probably going to take some adjusting. But if he can figure that out, then you can kind of flip the series, right? You know, and that's kind of if you're Indiana. I think the goal really in the first 2 games was just get one. You'd like to win game 1, but it's not, you know, the end all be all if you lose game 1.
Right.
If you lose game 2, that's where it starts to become more pressure packed and it starts to become really tough. But I think the goal if you're the road team is just get the split. You'd like to win the first game, but it doesn't always happen because obviously the first team sometimes is going to come out focused and ready. And that's what happened with the Bucks. You give them credit for that. You know,
Yeah.
even Doc Rivers, right? You give him credit for kind of making sure that these guys were prepared. You know, because he has been a guy that has been in a lot of playoff games, lost a lot of playoff games, but you know he did have a championship, you know, as well. even though it was a while ago. So again, props to the Bucks. We'll see if the Pacers adjust. But yeah, most of these games were pretty hideous, if I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, and even like looking at the Indiana one, Halliburton, it's tough because even when he was passing, his teammates were 9 of 26 on his passes solely.
He would have had more assists if because again, it wasn't like every shot was like great Milwaukee defense. As I mentioned, there were a
Yeah.
lot of overlooks.
Yeah, and I'm really gonna chalk this up to nerves for every young guy who hadn't had any playoff experience on the Pacers, because this was the first time they shot below 40% in a game this season. So the trend is trending pretty much in a bad direction, but I think there's a route for them to bounce back. But even Charles Barkley, I know it's crazy to quote Charles Barkley, but he was talking about this isn't the regular season, and that's true. A lot of these teams, the young ones specifically, are playing like it's the regular season because they haven't really seen any playoff action. And that's kind of what you expect. The problem is, once you get your footing, it could be, 3-1 lead or something like that. It might be too tough. And that's why we normally see younger teams not really win in the first round or make deep playoff runs. They kind of have to get that experience first. And that's what the Pacers are lacking here.
There's always a progression, right?
Yep.
It's not very common to go in your first time in the playoffs and win a playoff series. Even like the all-time great players, like if you look at their first postseason runs, right? They all usually lost, right? Normally in the first round, right? Normally they first come into the league, right? Even guys like Jordan or LeBron, right? They miss the playoffs their first years. First years they make the playoffs, they miss the first round. Then it gets better and better. And then eventually, right, you hope that you make that deep run. And the Pacers aren't there yet, right? So obviously they have a chance to pull off the upset, right? But again, if you're Milwaukee, this was probably the best type of game one you could have hoped for, where like Lillard reminds everybody that he's not done yet. He's still got Dame time left in him. And if he can play, up to the level that he was playing like last season for the Blazers, especially with Giannis being out, because we know he's probably still not going to come back in game 2. Then that's going to flip the series. The Homelander, highly overrated. Shea better. I mean,
I don't agree with the first half. I agree with the second half, though.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, like,
Shea's better than Halliburton, but Halliburton is nowhere near overrated.
Right,
under,
but
in my opinion.
But I do think the issues with Halliburton is the fact that when he's there are certain aspects of him in terms of the athleticism where it's sometimes it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get off his shot. Because it's a different type of shot. But again, he did have that injury earlier in the year, and he still probably hasn't recovered from it because he came back early because he wanted to get the 65. He is scared of the bright lights, and maybe he is. I mean, it definitely looked like it in the first game. And that's kind of the difference, right? With Shea, technically this isn't his first playoff series. So even he has seen playoff basketball. Obviously, it was very different because he wasn't, a superstar at that point. Because I think that was the Chris Paul Oklahoma City team. But for Halliburton, this is his first time, right?
Yeah.
So I think with Shea is the better player, right? And you can see that. That's one of the reasons why, part of that is, again, he's in the Western Conference. They're the number 1 seed. He's clearly the better player, right? You know what I mean? Whereas Indiana is a 6 seed in the Eastern Conference, which is weaker. Shea is definitely the better player, I think. But even in the OKC game, there were points in the game where it looked a little, where Shea looked at kind of a little bit different than
he looked
did.
rattled. But I think that was because of the pressure, though. They were making him uncomfortable because he was trying to do all the things that he normally does that we're accustomed to. The spin shots, the turnarounds, the fadeaways in the mid-range. But he's being met with, some freakishly long athletes,
Right.
It's different.
Yeah, exactly. It is different. And that's the thing. You look at the New Orleans defenders, and then you look over at, Milwaukee's defenders. It's not the same, right? There's no Herb Jones. There's no Trey Murphy, for Milwaukee.
The Pelicans
Middleton.
might double their wingspan in terms of the guys who were guarding them, respectively.
It's Middleton. It's Pat Bev. So that's the thing. I do think it was some first game jitters, but we both agree that Shea is the better player. I mean, we had him on All NBA first team. He's definitely the better player. And he should be the better player, to be honest, right? You know what I mean? He's more experienced. He's more seasoned. But I think also, again, there are some guys for, Oklahoma City that can do some stuff, right? The creators for Indiana, it's basically him and Siakam. but OKC is also the better team. MVP Shea, we'll see. So I guess in theory, we still have some more topics, right? Obviously, we have the games tomorrow, right? And then we also have they announced a lot of the finalists for the awards. So like, which one do you think we should get into first?
Might as well kick it off with MVP.
All right, so obviously, yeah, they announced the finalists for a lot of the awards. Right. So obviously for MVP, right? The three guys, right? It's Jokic, it's Luca, and then it's Shea, right? So I feel like my guess is that I think Jokic is probably going to win the MVP.
Hmm.
Like only because I think like if you look around, like, and the funny thing is online, somebody actually posted like a spreadsheet where they kind of like got like all of the voters, like the media voters that kind of like officially gave their vote for who's going to win a lot of the awards, and like most of them said Jokic. I think you can obviously make a very strong case for Shea Gilgeous-Alexander because it's the number one seed. He averaged over 30 a game with a team that nobody expected to do as good as they ended up doing. So I think that's kind of the easiest case, right? Obviously, I guess for Jokic, there's probably some of the analytic stats where it's probably going to be like net rating plus minus or whatever, right? They're like double digit points worse or whatever when he's not out there. But honestly, like I don't think I wouldn't be mad at all if Shea Gilgeous-Alexander won it because
Yeah.
it is a regular season award. Um, and he's been great this season, right? Better than I think anybody expected. I don't think he's gonna win it, but it would be really cool if he did, if I'm gonna be honest, right? Because like I think he probably like obviously like Luca I guess has a case too, but again, like that's the thing. Like it would, I just feel like Jokic is probably gonna win it, but I do think Shea has a really strong case too, just because of the team success combined with the numbers. I don't know, and that's the tough thing about MVP is that the criteria always changes every year, right? Because there's like some years where like the player on the number one seed wins the MVP. Then there's years where like the player that's on like the sixth seed ends up winning MVP, but they had crazy numbers and their team was not very good, so they end up winning it. There's no consistent criteria. And that's kind of what makes it tough. I guess that's also what kind of makes it entertaining
Hmm.
because you don't know necessarily who's going to win it. But I feel like Jokic is probably going to win it.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a case for Luca. He's averaging the insane numbers. And like you said, the problem would be his seeding, where he's the fifth seed. But yeah, I think there is a case, for sure for Shea. And I, like you said, I wouldn't be mad at it at all. I'd actually be happier if Shea probably won the MVP more than Jokic, even though like I'm a
It's
huge Jokic fan.
a great narrative, great story.
Exactly. Especially if they
Like,
can get out of the first round and even potentially get to the Western Conference Finals or something
right.
like that.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And the thing is, postseason success doesn't matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say worst case scenario, not hoping it happens at all, right? But let's say worst case scenario, they lose to New Orleans in the first round, right? But like the MVP vote would have already been chosen because it's a regular season award. Obviously, it'd be a bad look. Somebody got knocked out of the first round and won MVP. But it is a regular season award. So
Ironic,
that's
man.
yeah, yeah, because we have seen it before.
We've
Funny
seen it
enough.
before, and we've seen some others make some early exits. Last year it wasn't, a first round exit, but it was
Right.
more a second. But
It's
oh
really
well.
funny because if you look at the last several years, usually the person who wins MVP doesn't normally even win the title,
Yeah,
right? Like last year was Embiid, and
it's a
they
regular
lost.
season award.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they lost in the second round, right? The 2 years that Jokic won it, right? They didn't win the title. The 2 years Giannis won it, same thing. It's been a while. I think the last person that won the MVP and then also won the title, I think, was Steph. I think his first MVP back in 2015, which was almost a decade ago. Um, so that's kind of an interesting thing. Give SGA the crown. I just don't think they're gonna give it to him. I think they're gonna give it to Jokic. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I know that doesn't sound great, but I feel like they're gonna give it to him. I've seen the numbers in terms of like, in terms of like the media votes, like that so far they put out. Like, not that they're like quote unquote leaks or anything, but like there are a lot of people like on TV or in the media or whatever that have said like, yeah, I'm voting for so and so for this award. Low,
Lokic. Lokic. That's funny.
yeah,
El
yeah, and then
Jokic.
yeah, but yeah, it almost looks like low Keech.
Yeah,
But
yeah, Luke.
yeah, but defensive player of the year finalist, Gobert, Wemby, Bam Adebayo. And this is kind of where, like, the awards are really weird, right? Because, like, with Gobert, I think that was both of our picks for Defensive Player of the Year. And then you look at Victor Wembanyama, team is horrible. The team's defense isn't really that good, but he individually is a great defender.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's kind of the weird thing where it's like, okay, so the standings kind of matter here, but then they also don't. So it's like that doesn't really make any sense. Also, what the heck is Bam Adebayo doing in there? I know he's been really good defensively, but I think there's some guys that have been better.
Jonathan
right?
Isaac.
Yeah, exactly. Because we mentioned them, we put our all defensive teams together, right?
Mhm.
Like so. But either way, like I think Gobert's going to win that one.
He should.
They do have the number one defense, and it is a regular season award, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, again, let's say if Minnesota gets mollywopped in the first round by Phoenix and Gobert gets played off the floor. Not saying it's going to happen, but we've seen it before, right, from him. I think it's going to be different this year because there are a lot of really good defenders in Minnesota, but, it's a regular season award. So
Yeah. And it's like Gobert's the anchor of that defense. And, without him, they would not be that good, honestly.
Yeah.
Wemby, it's hard to make the case because, like you said, individually, he's amazing, but he's not really an anchor because there's nothing really to anchor there. He's just there, which is not a bad thing because he's a great individual player. But when we talk about Depoy, I think you have to look at the whole entire team and what that player brings to the entire system. Because even like last year, like Triple J, like you look at him and it's like, okay, cool. What?
No, I'm just remembering last year in the postseason.
I know, but regular season though, like you look at Memphis and they were elite.
Yes, exactly, and that's the thing is like there's so much context that goes in because then it's like, hey, that guy's a great individual defender carrying a lot of really poor defensive players, right? Obviously, like say with Wemby, there's just not a lot of super talented players on the team, period, right? But he individually was kind of able to hold it down.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously Gobert, unlike San Antonio, right? There's a lot more really good individual defenders, right? Bam Adebayo, I guess you have Jimmy Butler, who's obviously a very good defender, right? Caleb Martin, I don't think Miami's guards are that great defensively. They do have the zone defense. And then there's even other guys, like you mentioned, Jonathan Isaac is a great individual defender, but there's also a ton of really good defenders at other positions for, Orlando, right? A guy like AD, right? He individually is a great defender, but there's also a lot of really funny defenders for LA.
Funny is a good word for that.
Yeah. So that's kind of the thing, like when you look around. And that's kind of tough because, again, there's not always a consistent criteria. And it's like, should team success matter when it's an individual award? I don't think so. But at the same time, it seems like they do that for some and then they don't do it for others. So it's just kind of an annoying thing. Claw for Defensive Player of the Year. I think he's played enough games, but I don't think he's going to get it. I mean, they already have the 3 finalists.
Yeah, that would be a wild. That would have been a wild Depoy.
Yeah, but let's see. And then obviously looking around, right? Rookie of the Year, right? It was Wemby, Chet, Brandon Miller. We already know who's going to win that, right? It's like he's been running away with that for a while.
Yeah.
Right.
They even closed the betting on it like very early.
Right. 6th Man of the Year, Naz Reid, Malik Monk, Bobby Portis. My pick was Malik Monk, but I wouldn't be mad if Naz Reid won it because he has been very good off the bench.
Amazing.
I think Monk getting hurt to close out the season probably hurt his case. And obviously it looks worse now that, like, Sacramento's not in the playoffs, but it is a regular season award. So you can make the case that can make Monk's case stronger.
Yeah.
Look at how Sacramento closed the season without him. But I think Naz Reid is going to win that one.
Yeah. They're all basically 6 starters, which is the point.
Yeah. I mean, Bobby Portis is starting right now in place of Giannis. So.
Boom.
And then most improved, Kobe White, Tyrese Maxey, Alperen Şengün. My pick was Kobe White. I think Tyrese Maxey is going to win it.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously it's kind of funny because his stats once Embiid went down, mainly in terms of efficiency.
Yep.
And I think some people are going to be like, well, he was already really good. So, why can't Alperen Şengün or Kobe White get it? I mean, that's just kind of what happens. Like I said, I wouldn't have a problem with any of them. My pick was Kobe White because he literally went from a bench player to a starter. But, it's probably going to be Max.
Yeah, I look at most improved like for the guys who jump a tier, where it's like Kobe White was kind of like a guy who was in and out of the starting lineup, bench player a lot, and then now he's kind of like their lead guy, which is kind of wild to think about.
Yeah, it's kind of like the year that Ja Morant won it, and I think some people were like, well, what about like Jordan Poole or
Right.
whatever, right? Yeah, and like Ja Morant was already really good,
Yeah.
but some people would say, hey, it's really impressive to go from like an All Star or whatever to like an All NBA guy. That might actually be a harder jump than going from
Yeah.
like a bench guy to like a starting caliber player.
Right.
Like, I mean, again, like it's
I
always
get
kind
it.
of a cool. I think it's a cooler narrative to get it to the guy who was worse and now it's like a lot better
Yeah.
versus like the guy who's already good. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't make the rules around here.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Coach of the year, right? Mark Dagnall, I think, is the guy that should win it, right? I think the other ones were Jamal Mosley and Chris Finch.
Yep.
I think they all have strong cases, for it, right? Wouldn't be mad if any of them won it. But again, you got the 1 seed after missing the playoffs, in the previous year. So I think that deserves a lot of praise. Joe Mazzulla isn't on it at all, even though they won 64 games, which is kind of interesting. But I think people are going to look at the fact that they were already good. So it's,
But look at the
that's,
roster, though. Like,
yeah,
honestly.
right. And it's like, how could you not win 60 games in the East with that roster?
Right.
Still impressive. And again, same thing that changes every year because we've seen some years where if you win the most games, you're going to win Coach of the Year. Like I think, one of the years, I think Steve Kerr won it, right? The first 2 years, right? I
Yeah.
think if I'm not
Yep.
mistaken,
Yep.
both the 73 and the 67 win year. But then there were other years where like somebody else won it and they like Mike Brown won it last year and the Kings were the 3 seed in the Western Conference, right? So we've seen years where you don't have to be the top seed. It's just kind of like, I guess, the team that had the most surprising jump, right? And OKC is probably the one that's the most surprising jump, um, other than I guess probably Orlando. But I feel like with Orlando, like the foundation was a little bit different. Whereas with OKC, wow, they're in the West and they're the 1 seed, right? Versus like Orlando being the 5 seed in the East, which is impressive. But yeah,
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think when we did the video, I had picked Chris Finch, and I think that was because the Timberwolves were the 1 seed. So I was kind of going by the logic of whoever got the 1 seed in the West was probably going to win Coach of the Year. And yeah, Dagonaut for sure deserves it. To take the Thunder and be kind of like the unpredictable #1 seed in the West is like a huge feat, I think.
yeah. So I mean, yeah, and then pretty much now I guess you move on to Monday, right? Now it's no longer going to be like 4 games, over the course of an entire day. It's going to be a little bit different, right? Where they're going to have like 3 games. Two of them are going to kind of run at the same time, right? The Cavs Magic one, they knew which one to put on NBA TV,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they know not as many people are going to be as interested in that one.
Yeah.
Um, and then obviously you have the Sixers and Knicks. You got the Lakers Nuggets, right? Those are the TNT games, right? So those are more of the marquee matchups. Um, I feel like the home teams are probably going to win all three of them.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like I think that like it's kind of clear that like the home teams are just better. Obviously Cleveland, we'll see what Orlando does, but their offense is just so inconsistent. Um, Philly could storm back, and kind of win game 2, maybe. It really just depends on Embiid. Like if he looks like he did in the first half of game 1, then they have a pretty good shot of winning game 2. We just don't know, right?
Yeah.
In the first half, he did the self lob, came down on his leg, looked really gimpy. Wasn't sure if he was going to come back, and then in the second half, he just didn't look the same. So I don't really know for that one. Right in the Nuggets, we both think that's the best team in the NBA. So we expect them to come out of the West and win the chip and go back to back. So not enough said pretty much there.
Yeah.
So
And it's like, New York, I think New York and Philadelphia is probably the only one where I could potentially see, like, the away team potentially taking it. But at the same time, it's the Garden. I don't think they're going to let that slide, Not this early. Maybe
yeah,
if it was like a game 7 or something like that. But in game 2, I don't foresee them dropping the ball. I think Brunson's definitely going to have a better game now that they know how Philly's kind of attacking them.
yeah, and with the Knicks, like you mentioned, the Garden is kind of the key, and that's kind of the thing. Like with the Knicks, where it's like it'll be interesting to see if they win the series, right? Because we remember, right, the Cavs they tanked that last game of the season so they could drop to 4-5 to get that Orlando matchup
Yep.
because they did not want to face the Sixers in the first round.
New York
Or
won their
maybe,
final game.
yeah, you said what?
I said in New York won their final game
Yeah, New
to
York
to
won their
secure it.
final game. Yeah, exactly, right? Because I think if the Knicks had lost, with the Bucks losing, the Cavs would have been 2, and they would have been forced to play Philly. But the Knicks won the game because they wanted the 2 seed, like you said, and you secure home court, right? Other than the Boston series, right? Because
Yeah.
Boston's the only team that they're going to play where they're not going to have home court, and that can be really important, especially like if it's a long series and it's a game 7, you want to be at home for that last game because that's a huge advantage, right? If it's a game 7 in New York, that crowd is going to go nuts, especially if they, come out strong or if they pull it out in the fourth, right? Like they love that team.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, like in terms of like other stuff, I mean, not really like a whole lot, and we'll get that into some of those things like in our regular episodes. But what do you kind of think of? There was like a report from Mark Stein talking about Chris Paul, where it was like if he enters free agency, the Spurs could be a possible destination. What do you kind of think of that? Like, because that was kind of a team that we almost kind of wondered, like, would the Spurs kind of just randomly trade for him and have him just kind of like mentor the young guys, or was an actual contender going to trade for him? I don't know because I don't even know what the Warriors are going to do with this contract because it's like obviously, if he were to enter free agency, they would have to non-guarantee his contract and basically waive him.
Yeah.
Would they want to do that? Maybe to get under the luxury tax if they can't find a good deal. I'd imagine they would try to find a good deal first. But what do you think of that?
I mean, I think it would be intriguing. I think that's the best way that I can kind of describe it because I don't know if he's down for that. I'm sure he's probably looking more for a ring at this point than, another mentorship program, which I think he's done about 2 of those now. So I don't, I like it from, a basketball fit standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, I don't foresee that happening. But, I think that would be a smart move for San Antonio because imagine, Chris Paul. Imagine your entry passes as Wembanyama coming from Chris Paul, pick and roll, lobs. Then, maybe you even draft a point guard. You draft a point guard, in this potential weak draft class, and then he's mentored by Chris Paul. That elevates his potential by like, tenfold. But, I think it would be intriguing to see, Chris Paul in the Spurs.
I guess the main question for me is, again, how does he get there? Because it's like Golden State would have to waive him, and
Yeah.
that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless they just literally can't find a trade and they just want him gone. Like I feel like they kind of liked him on that team, but do they like him enough, to keep him at 30 million, right? Because you could technically, I think, non-guarantee his contract and then just like re-sign him for a cheaper deal, I think. But I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah,
Like
very.
just not really something I expected, especially because, like you said, I would think if I'm Chris Paul, I would like to probably get a last chance at a ring. The Homelander says, "Ew." I mean, I think you would hope for like it's not going to be an OKC type impact when he was there because he's just not the same player. But I think, like you said, you would hope he would just be like a mentor to the young guys. It would almost be like more of an off the court type of thing,
Yeah.
more so than on
Mentorship
the court.
program, dude.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know. He's done, bro. I mean, hey, I wasn't really super high on him going there. I
Yeah.
mean, in Golden State, I mean, he wasn't bad, at all. But what did you really accomplish with it, right? Like you missed the playoffs as the 10 seed. I mean, yeah, I know the Draymond thing happened, but like, I don't know. Like, I just never really thought it made a ton of sense. I understood it like from a basketball standpoint, where it's like Poole was bad, so you wanted to bring somebody else in who was a little bit more professional and kind of probably did more of what you would have wanted somebody to do in the second unit. But I just think he's a little too over the hill. He can still shoot fine. It just made them so small when he was out there. And like when he's out there with Steph, like, and others, it just looks kind of just like a clown show to me. Like where it's like you're not getting stops, like you're getting scored on pretty much at will. You don't really have any guards out there that can really defend. It just that was my concern always was more so on the defensive end. I know he can still kind of make some smart plays, but he's not the same guy defensively. And I think at this point, he probably is better suited as like a backup point guard role. So I guess for Golden State, that's okay, but I don't know. That just the Spurs one, I don't know. Like unless you just have no other options, I would probably try to opt for somebody younger, and that's probably just better.
Yeah.
Like you know what I mean?
Yeah. I would wait probably for. I would probably draft a wing, honestly. In this coming draft, maybe like a project guy, like maybe like somebody like Mataz or whatever, and then maybe go, guard in the next class. Because I'm telling you, like those guys, I think are a little bit more generational talent closer to that level of skill.
Can I interest you in Nikola Topic?
Yeah, I'm good off of Topic. If anybody in the chat knows who Topic is, please let me know. I want to hear your thoughts on him because I think he's like a Luka Doncic that can't shoot, can't do anything, but he's fast. Done. You know, that's how I feel about him. Like he's a 20-something percent 3-point shooter. Like it's really bad.
I mean, yeah, we'll see. And obviously we'll get into the draft in the
Yeah.
offseason when that comes. But it's the playoffs now, right? Playoffs are here. Game 1s are done. So on to game 2 for all of these teams starting, on Monday.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we've hit the hour and 15 mark. And we've actually got to record a video after this. So I think we're going to head on out of here. Thank you for everybody who came through on the live stream and supported us. I know, you guys love these a lot. And we will be doing them, as the series progress and as the playoffs progress, more so eliminations. But, in the next round, we will be doing, more of those intro level ones where it's like, in this series openers and whatnot. So once again, thank you everybody for showing up. We'll see you on the next episode.